Thank you for joining me in this conversation on how we can enact metacognition as a pedagogical emphasis in our English language classrooms. Maimun and I have experience in the primary level English classroom, so last 3 in secondary EL classrooms, and we are glad to have Dr. Lee Nan Ho, an expert with both classroom and research experience in metacognition, join us in this conversation. So welcome all of you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Metacognition is one of the pedagogical emphases in the English Language Teaching and Learning Syllabus 2020. Now, from a curriculum perspective, could you help us understand what it means to place a pedagogical emphasis on metacognition?
Thanks, Kapana, for the question. I think there are two parts to your question. One is pedagogical emphasis, the other one is metacognition. When we talk about pedagogical emphasis, I think two words will come to my mind. One is being intentional. As a teacher, we're being intentional in planning for this to happen in a classroom. Okay. The other thing is being explicit. Explicit not in the way just we teach, but also explicit in the way such that even the students are aware that they are learning that. If we actually look at what metacognition is a life skills that cuts across discipline. So when we talk about having metacognition as a pedagogical emphasis, I think there's a need for us to also consider transfer of learning.
In the context of English language teaching and learning, to pedagogically emphasize metacognition is to be intentional when designing learning experiences and enacting them, and that is to build students' metacognitive ability, even as they are performing cognitive learning tasks like listening, reading, viewing, speaking, writing, representing, or even using grammar and vocabulary.
I agree that metacognition is a necessary competency for all students to have in their learning journey. Now, as I teach a primary 3 class this year, I decided to start by raising my students' awareness about what happens when they read. I think when students are aware of the cognitive processes involved in reading for understanding and appreciation, I can then build on the metacognitive and metalinguistic awareness. Okay, class, we've spent a lot of time reading. Let's think what goes on in our mind when we read. First, why do we read? Okay, let me call Kaylee.
To get more information.
Do you mean to get information about the world around us? Okay, yes, Mavis?
Yes, we need to find out more about the world around us, like reading a instruction manual to find out how to play a game.
Interesting. Have you all had those experiences where you read for information, read for how to fix puzzles? Yes or no, class?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yes, Eva?
We read because it's fun.
Why is reading fun?
Because it gives us the different stuff.
Another interesting point. How does reading take us to places? Okay. Is a book an aeroplane?
No.
A train?
No.
Okay. So how does reading take you to places? Okay, Audrey?
Reading takes us to places like showing us illustrations, and the illustrations will let you imagine about you.
What you're trying to say is when you see the pictures, you imagine you're somewhere else.
Yes.
That's how it takes you to places.
It's not like you fly an aeroplane or a dragon or something.
Okay, nice. Avik Nayan?
If there are no pictures, we can visualize the words that we see in the book.
Good. Okay, these are important points. Okay, the words, the illustrations, and whatever we see in the book helps us to imagine and takes us to places. Okay, so it helps to stimulate our mind and our senses. So that is why reading is fun. Okay, so to let the words and pictures take us to places, we must give it some time, right? Yes, Afi?
Yes, Madam Maimun. I enjoy reading the most when I take time to think as I read.
Yes, so we need to give it time. Now, I'd like you to think what happens before you read, when you're reading, and after you've read. Take some time to jot down your thoughts.
Before we read, we notice many things about a book. like the cover. We can make predictions about the story.
We can also reflect on past experiences. During reading, we need to check our predictions and also try to understand the words in the story.
We also need to understand how the story develops. Don't forget about making connections to our experiences. We also need to remember other people's experiences and feelings. After reading, we must check our understanding. We can answer comprehension questions too.
We can also change the ending.
We can reflect on the moral of the story.
Wow, this is such a rich list of what happens during the 3 phases of reading. Okay, well done. Give yourself a round of applause. I have a question for you. Why do we want to know what happens when we read? Okay, Anthony?
So that we will not have to wait for you to tell us what to do next.
True?
Then maybe we don't understand what we're reading. We will know what we can do about it, Madam Maimun.
Yes, exactly. Okay, it helps us to be more effective in the reading process. There are times when we make connections with our experiences and we also check our understanding, the process of going back and forth. And this is one of the learner strategies that you have learned.
Maimun, that looks like a good way to raise your students' awareness about reading and viewing skills and understanding that reading and viewing is an active process that helps them to make sense and appreciate the text that they're reading. And you went on to build their metacognitive and metalinguistic awareness in the reading and viewing process. But what guided you in planning and enacting this learning experience for your students?
I referred to the English syllabus for skills and learner strategies, both cognitive and metacognitive for reading and viewing. And apart from using the Stella guidelines for the lesson, I was also more intentional in contextualizing what my students are learning by having them build on their experiences of reading and viewing since primary 1. Yeah.
Maimun, you applied not only the CLIPS principle of contextualization, but also of learner-centeredness and process orientation. I think what is heartening is the fact that you put the students at the heart of the teaching and learning process, and you also empowered them by strengthening their understanding of what goes on when they read and view.
And of course, you also employed the accolade teaching processes of raising awareness and instructing explicitly, which is critical for students to pay attention to what is to be learned. And it also helps them to build clarity about the reading and viewing skills, learner strategies, and the processes in this lesson.
Yes, I realized that I needed to be explicit about explaining the 3 phases in the reading and viewing process. It was so interesting to watch my students as they realized that there was much more to the act of reading than just decoding words in a text.
I'm actually very, very happy to hear this because I think research have shown that the development of cognitive and metacognitive competency, right, could not actually happen in a vacuum. So what we're doing is now trying to develop a student's metacognition through the context of the Singapore EL curriculum. And what it means is that we are tapping also on the principles as well as curriculum emphasis of the EL curriculum. So well done.
In the lesson, one student said that he enjoyed the reading experience most when he had time to think. To me, that is important and a necessary consideration for all of us when we plan and enact lessons. And I would say, especially for secondary students, as they encounter more complex texts and tasks, it is critical to give them the time to develop, to build their metacognitive awareness and ability, even as they make use of the cognitive skills and learner strategies.
There is certainly value in offering students more time to learn as they perform language tasks such as reading, speaking and writing. But here is my dilemma. While I agree that my students are definitely more engaged in the reading lesson, when I pay attention to building their metacognitive ability, it takes me much longer to complete my lesson with them. So, Ngan Ho, could you advise how we can manage this time factor?
Thanks, Maimun, for the wonderful question. A question that many teachers ask me, maybe in a slightly different way. They would ask me, Ngano, where do I find time to cover the syllabus? Yeah, and I always say, don't try to cover the syllabus because nobody can see the syllabus then. Yeah. But jokes aside, right? I think what is important is to appreciate that the word, what metacognition is. Metacognition. When our students, right, are developed metacognitively, it helps them to sharpen their cognition, which means that generally speaking, they have greater cognitive power. And this is where when they become metacognitive, you'll find them to be more effective and more efficient in trying to handle the task that we gave them. But what is actually crucial is also for us to appreciate that learning itself is a cognitive task. Okay, so when our students become more metacognitive, they not only learn about the content, they learn about their own learning. And this is where metacognition is a key ingredient in self-directed learning. And if we want our students to be truly self-directed learners, what is a better place than school itself for us to expose them to self-directed learning. So this is where I would also like us as teachers to think about, maybe it's time for us to think about how we could also delegate part of the content that we need to our students to learn to be put under self-directed learning with our guidance.
I have to agree with Ngan Ho that having taken the time to for my students to build their metacognitive awareness, right, about reading and viewing processes, I realize that their conversations now about the text that they read are richer. Going slower definitely allowed me to go faster with time. Yeah.
I'd like to bring us back to our earlier point of conversation about the intentionality when planning and enacting the English language lessons, especially that emphasize on metacognition. So Maimun, you explained to us how you were intentional when planning your lessons, and you referred to the EL syllabus for guidance. Now that guidance is for the designing of the learning experience, and that built your students' cognitive skills as well as metacognitive ability through the learner strategies, right? But in what ways were you intentional in carrying out, in enacting these lessons?
Okay, let me use the example of the Think Aloud that I enacted in my lesson to show my students what is involved in the process of making predictions in the before reading phase. So class, this is a text that we're going to read. Are you excited to find out what this text is all about?
Yes!
Okay, so before we do that, I'm going to do a Think Aloud. Let me get my thinking hat. When I look at the title, I see Prince Zuck and the Wise Frog. So I know there will be two characters in this story, Prince Zuck and the Wise Frog. Now, if I were to look at the pictures, at the illustration, I think this could be Prince Zuck. But I wonder what is he doing with the horse? And when I look at his face, he has that expression of perhaps being shocked or frightened. And then when I move on to this picture over here, I see a frog. Is he the wise frog? And what has he got to do with this story? Now, when I combine the title and the illustration, I remember reading a story whereby a witch had cast a spell on the prince and turned him into a frog. Would this story be similar to that? So now, groups 1 to 4, can you buzz? Remember the question I asked you? What did I do when I think aloud? And groups 5 to 9, you're supposed to observe what I say when I do my think aloud. Now let's hear from the groups who noticed what I thought aloud to myself and the groups who noticed what I did. Now as your friends speak, I want everybody to listen and add on if you have things to add on. Okay, just raise your hand, I will call you. Now, let me start with what I did. Okay, yes, Anamika?
You look at the title and content. The book will seem like you are talking to yourself.
Okay, that's an interesting description. Okay, yes, I was discussing the picture with the title, and I'm talking to myself. Yes, so what did I say in that discussion? Valerie.
You like what and why expression.
Can you?
What is the boy doing and why does he look worried?
Yes. Cherish.
You also asked how questions, such as how is the frog a part of the story?
Yes, I did ask those questions. Okay. Now, is there something you all do when you read? Yes. Okay. Now, before reading, do you look at the title, the cover page, and have a conversation with yourself? Yes, Taylor, what do you have to say?
I do that when I am using books in the library and I guess what the book is about by using the cover page. The pictures in the cover page and the title.
What a wonderful observation. Okay, so this is what you do outside the classroom. So whatever we are learning here is not only applied in the classroom, but we also do it outside the classroom. What else did I say to myself? Alfred?
You remember another book about frog prince that is similar to this story? They were wondering if this story is the same.
Yes, great observation. So, what am I doing here? I'm making a text to text connection, right? So, why did I ask all those questions and do what I did before even opening the book? Isabel, yes.
You are using strategies to make predictions.
Yes. What are these strategies, learner strategies we've been talking about? Yes, Charlotte?
We use visual cues on the book cover and make text-to-text connections.
Okay, so let me capture that. So in enacting Think Aloud, I thought about how I could be more intentional in building my students' metacognitive awareness in making predictions in the before reading phase. I believe I didn't just make my thinking visible to my students. I invited the students to pay attention to what I was saying to myself and what I did during the Think Aloud.
And after you model the Think Aloud, you asked your students why you asked yourself questions and, why you did what you did before you actually look at the text in itself. Yeah.
Yes, those were intentional teaching actions that I enacted to explicitly build awareness, guide learning through discovery, and explain the process and strategies I had used in making predictions.
And I think at this point, I would like to mention that generally speaking, metacognition has two phases, the awareness as well as the regulation. And I think because one is dependent on the other, what is important is also to appreciate that the awareness phase is quite instrumental and important and foundational in trying to develop students to be metacognitive. And this is where, from our own research, we found that in terms of students' awareness of their own cognitive resources, there are those who have only a superficial or even erroneous kind of awareness versus those which are deep and accurate. And I think this is where your teacher modeling will promote a much deeper awareness of students' cognitive resources.
Those were useful suggestions, Anho, and I participated in your workshop on enabling students to be metacognitive. And I remember an interesting way that you described how we could activate our students' metacognition in the classroom. I think you called it the ABC of activating metacognition.
Thanks, Kapana, for supporting my workshops. And I'm going to try to explain this ABC, right, in the context of Maimun's lesson. I think when we talk about trying to develop students metacognitively, we introduce tasks, teaching and learning tasks. And I think we need some kind of criteria in terms of deciding which are the tasks that will be more effective. And we talk about ABC in terms of A being an attempt that's made by the student. B, there's a blockage in terms of the task between the goal and the final solution in terms of from the child's perspective. And C is the child can actually do that. That's important because what we're talking about is that the task, first of all, must be something that the students can relate with, all right? So that they make an attempt. However, the thing is that in order for them to activate their higher order thinking skills and metacognition, there need to be a blockage between them and the solution. So in other words, there must be some kind of productive struggle. Okay? In other words, the task must be challenging to this particular group of students. C is that they can do it. That means it's within the means of the children. In other words, right, if we truly want to activate students' metacognition in our quest, right, to develop them metacognitively, we should think about tasks that truly engage, challenge, and tasks that are within the means of the students. In other words, truly good teaching and learning tasks that activate metacognition are those whereby we design with our students in mind. In other words, to be a good teacher of metacognition, I think we need to know our students very well.
So in a subsequent lesson during reading phase, I guided my students in selecting and using learner strategies for making inferences about the meaning of unfamiliar words in another story. So perhaps you can take a look at that segment to see whether and how I have activated my students' awareness and how I've supported them in their metacognitive awareness. Okay, class, we read this story yesterday and we found some words that were unfamiliar to us. So what can we do about that? Yes, Lydia?
We need to find the meanings of these words. How to understand the story without doing that?
Well, I would have said that differently, but I totally agree with you. Now, when we read, it's the choice of words, phrases, as well as sentence structures that make what we read interesting and meaningful. But we may not know the meanings of all the words and all the phrases that we read, right? So what can we do? Now, we spoke about this when we were looking at the meanings of words in Prince Zag and the Wise Frog. Think about your response first before you raise your hand to let me know that you're ready. My question is, when we are reading, what can we do to find the meaning of a word that is unfamiliar to us? Think. Okay, are you ready? Okay, yes, Zion?
We can make intelligent guesses about their meaning.
How do you do that? Yes, Kaiser?
We look at the words around the word that we do not know. This will give us the meanings of the difficult word.
Who else? Yes, Miranda?
For example, we can look at how the word relates to others in a story, like whether it looks like it has a similar or different meaning to another word.
Okay, that's using contextual clues, right? Yes. What else can we do? Yes, Jalen?
You can also break up the big word into smaller parts. This helps us guess the meaning of the big word could be.
Okay, that's because we know that words can be made up of different parts, right? And we may know the meaning of one part but not the other. Okay. Yes, Eva.
These parts are the root word and the prefixes and the suffixes.
Prefixes and suffixes, yes. Do you have an example of that, any of you? Well, I'm very happy that you can recall what we've learned before. So here are the learner strategies that you can use to make intelligent guesses about meanings of words that we do not know. Yes, Yitong?
I noticed that we can use contextual clues to make predictions and inferences.
That's a lovely observation. Yes, Zhixuan?
Actually, making inferences about the meaning of a difficult word is like making prediction of the story. We are making guesses using what we already know and the cues in the story. We are like detectives.
Book detectives!
Yes, we are all book detectives when we are reading. So now let's get some detective work done, yeah? In making inferences using this story, Spilled Milk. Now, in your groups, identify a word that you're not familiar with. Select the appropriate learner strategies that you can use and make inferences about the meaning of that word. Okay, proceed.
Maimun, I really like your first question in that particular segment. You pointed out that the students had some words in the text that were very unfamiliar to them, right? And you asked the question, now, what should we do about that? I feel that that question prompted them to think about the learner strategies they were already familiar with for making inferences. And that's how they started building from that point to learn more about other learner strategies.
Yeah, and that's how, right? During that conversation, you could see that the students, I think one of your students even pointed out that using contextual clues is a strategy that can be used for making predictions as well as for making inferences.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was.
And I want to add on that I think the intentionality in trying to help students to develop metacognitively, you have gone beyond just getting them to be more aware of their cognitive resources. I notice that you are now trying to get them into the regulatory phase of their metacognitive practice, whereby the thing is students start to think about what kind of cognitive resources to mobilize in order for them to tackle the given task that you have for them. But when we talk about regulation, right, other than making a choice of what kind of cognitive resources to mobilize and employ, there's also another factor, and that's being evaluative. And this is where I think it would be wonderful if we can get students to also work in groups whereby they start to make their thinking not only audible but visible to one another. Because in that context, right, it's very natural for the child to start thinking about how do I defend my choice? How do I defend my decision? And this is where I think the group work, right, would move the regulatory phase, right, to even much deeper by encouraging our students to start evaluating their choices and decisions.
So, which word has this group chosen to make inferences about? Okay, Xuan Ming, can you read the part of the story that has this word and point the word to everyone?
Here's the part of the story. It's your turn to roll, Dinesh. You know it is, exclaimed Hannah. Dinesh groaned. Ugh, my arms ache from rowing and it's too hot in this life jacket. Why can't Sun Weng row? The word we've identified is groan.
How will you make inferences about its meaning? Can you all do your think aloud while you do so?
Must we use your hand?
Well, you don't need that. But as you're thinking aloud, I will pop in to make a comment or ask a question or two.
Okay, let me start. I am using what I see in the picture. It shows that this boy who is rowing the boat and he is sweating. He is the only one with the oars. The picture also shows that he is unhappy. So groan could mean unhappy, sad, or some other negative feeling.
The nice thinking. What you're using here is visual cues to make inferences.
Yes, but I also noticed that the one ends with ed, which tells me it's most likely a verb in its past tense form. This is puzzling because we've just said the word could mean unhappy or sad. So is the word a verb or an adjective?
Okay, I'm happy that you're using your knowledge of word class to make the inferences here, okay? Now, Xuan Ming, how would you like to respond to Afi's question?
I think not all words that end with ed are words in the past tense form. Words like excited and amused can be used to describe feelings, so they are adjectives.
But if groaned is an adjective, then the sentence would be Dinesh was groaned, but it's not.
Since the sentence is Dinesh groans, groans is a verb in the past tense in this sentence. So maybe groans is an action that is done unhappily.
That makes sense. In the parts of the story, before and after the sentence, Dinesh groaned. He is first unhappy, and when Hannah insisted that it's his turn to row, Dinesh probably felt a bit angry.
Dinesh also said, "Oh, my arms ache from rowing and it's too hot in this life jacket. Why can't Sungan row?" He's whining and complaining.
So, we can make the inference that the word groan means complain.
Let's try putting complaint in the sentence. Dinesh complained, "Oh, my arms ache from rowing and it's too hot in this life jacket. Why can't Sun Wang row?" Hey, it does make sense.
You know what? I'm really pleased with how you made your inferences, okay? And you were really engaged in the process. Now, what were the learner strategies that you used when you're making inferences?
Contextual clues, visual cues, and grammatical cues.
And we didn't have to check the dictionary.
Well, you could if you want to be certain that groaned can mean complained. But good job, everyone.
In that collaborative group work context, the students showed meta-linguistic awareness and they were engaged in metacognitive talk as they went about making inferences about unfamiliar words. I think, Maimun, you were intentional in encouraging your students' inquiry through dialogue. When you prompted them to do the think aloud for themselves, right? You were giving them the opportunity to articulate how they were selecting and using the learner strategies as they go about making inferences.
Yes, and I could also see, right, how they were building on each other's discoveries. That was good.
And it's clear that Maimun's role in enabling all this is through employing the teaching processes called accolade, and you did it with intentionality, Maimun. And this is what we could see from the video, right? She did a couple of things. Number one, she guided discovery, she instructed explicitly, she enabled application, she facilitated assessment for learning, and she structured consolidation. And I thought I particularly liked the way you release the responsibility to the students in their groups to do their think aloud, and yet you were there to support and stretch your students' thinking and their thinking about their thinking.
Thanks, Dorothy. And I want to follow up on one of the points that you brought up, assessment for learning. Very often we talk about promoting assessment for learning in a classroom, but you look at the way we actually promote students' metacognitive development by encouraging them to make their thinking visible and audible to themselves. But once they make their thinking audible and visible to themselves, it is also audible and visible to the teachers. And this is where teachers will then truly get the real data and evidence of students' learning, and as such use that to shape our instruction more effectively. So that definitely will be promoting assessment for learning. In this respect, right, may I just check with Maimun? Because I noticed that you actually put up the butcher sheets in your classroom which contains, right, the learner strategy that both you and the learner co-constructed. May I know what's your intention in doing so?
These butcher sheets are to make explicit the learner strategies the students have learned, and I routinely invite them to consider selecting and using appropriate learner strategies for new language learning tasks. When they are not bogged down with having to recall the learner strategies, I can focus on building their metacognitive ability as language learners and users.
I think these butcher sheets and routines, right, do help students at various levels of readiness as they engage in metacognitive processing. And they also help in building a shared meta-language in the development of both cognitive and metacognitive abilities. While teachers in the earlier years at the primary level set the routines for learning, I feel that upper primary and secondary teachers can empower their students to select the routines for themselves and then attempt to unblock the blockages as they perform the learning tasks.
I think in the series of lessons, one of the things that came across quite clearly was how Maimun released the responsibility to her students, a gradual release of responsibility, because you started by giving a lot of support for them to build metacognition. Then over time, you gave the responsibility of the planning, selecting, using, monitoring and evaluating the use of the learner strategies for performing the language tasks to the students.
And I want to just pick up on a point that this is the kind of support that actually Maimun is giving to the students' metacognitive development. Because very often we forgot about the power of a chart or poster in our classroom. They are actually quite powerful. They are actually helping our students to form what we call visual memory. So in other words, when our students start to create an awareness of what kind of cognitive resources they have, this kind of visual memory will help them to actually have a more accurate level of awareness of their cognitive resources. Earlier on, I mentioned deeper. This is an example whereby the visual memory allows them to have a more accurate recall of the kind of cognitive resources that they could have. And therefore, they become more effective when they start regulating their own cognitive resources.
So it's very clear from our conversation that learning transfer can definitely take place within the EL classroom. But what about beyond the EL classroom? So Nanhu, what can we do, what can be done for to teach metacognition for learning transfer beyond the EL classroom?
Thanks, Kalpana, for bringing us back to that conversation about transfer of learning. And I think to do that, there are two things that we need to address. Very often the thing is, I think within the transfer of the learning in the subject, in this case, English language, is quite easy because it's the same teacher who's teaching it. However, when you're trying to do a transfer of learning across discipline, and this is where I think there's a need for the school to develop a kind of common vocabulary so that students can actually identify and talk about their thinking processes using the same kind of words. And this is where the transfer will be much easier. But I think the other thing about develop our students' metacognitive and trying to cause that transfer, is actually to recall that metacognition is actually a habit of mind. In other words, the thing is to get our students, to remember to do that, not only in an English class, but also in a maths class, science class, like a humanities class. Then the thing is, I must have some kind of habit or disposition towards asking a certain kind of question about my thinking. And this is where I think it's important to develop the kind of prompts, that students eventually has the habit of just using it. I call them haunting prompts. The prompts that, without a teacher saying that, they could hear it, Now, however, the thing is to do that, and I think what's important is that the prompt can be used in different contexts. In other words, the stem of this prompt need to be generic. Sufficient generic. Now, however, as we mentioned earlier on, there are different learners in our classroom. So it is also important to ask ourselves, what if those weaker students, they may not be as strong in their language? All right, then this is where the thing is that as teachers, we should not only just develop this kind of generic prompts, but each of the discipline teachers, may want to think about how am I going to make this prompt contextualized by adding the part that's more specific to the prompt to help our students to think. In other words, to actually promote that transfer, we need a common language. We also need a set of common prompts. But common prompts that should not be too abstract while it's being generic, but allow us to contextualize within each of the subjects.
It's time we round up our session with some key takeaways from our professional conversation. So Maimun, would you like to start?
So firstly, I believe being intentional in planning my lessons, giving time to my students to plan and select the learner strategies that they want to use in performing their language task. I think that they need time to monitor, adjust and evaluate the learner strategies that they've chosen. This would enable them to regulate their learning. Yep.
Thank you. Sulastri?
For me, applying more intentionally the principles and processes of EL teaching and learning, clips and accolade.
Okay, thank you. No?
Yeah, Kapita, I want to go back to my initial statement about metacognition is a life skill that cut across different disciplines. In fact, research have shown that this is the kind of competency that's employed by experts when they're solving problem, right? So it is important and necessary for us as teachers to be intentional and explicit in developing students' metacognition. But what is really important as well is actually to engender a culture within the schools where we actively promote the transfer of learning of metacognition. This will help us to prepare our students to be better in terms of living in a world where change is the only constant, and whereby in such a case, right, I think solving problem is the only way for us to move forward.
That's true. That's true. Thank you so much. It was such a wonderful conversation. I think we all benefited from this very rich professional conversation. Thank you, Maimun, for letting us into your EL classroom, and to Solastri and Nanho. Thank you for contributing to this rich professional conversation on enacting metacognition as a pedagogical emphasis in our EL classroom.
Thank you.
Thank you.